Great things can happen over a glass of wine, or beer, maybe coffee, but I'm going to concentrate on wine. Now, I'm a scientist, and despite the stereotypes that we're shy or socially awkward, we actually love to get together, especially if it's over a drink, and especially if we're talking about science. We can be at a conference and listen to talks on science for 8 hours straight, and we will still want to go to the bar together, share a drink, and argue about that scientist. We might be trying to play it cool while in the middle of a pool game with a Nobel Prize winner, sipping our drink and nerding out about their science. We might meet together over a beer with a colleague and talk about shared interests and walk away with a new collaboration that can change with what we're doing in our labs. I had one such conversation recently in an unexpected place, the community pool of all places. I was talking to my friend Danny Fain, and we were talking about our shared love of yeast. Yes, yeast. I'm a molecular biologist, and in my lab, I use yeast to study fundamental questions about how life works. Danny is a historical brewer at Ardent Brewery, and he loves to bring historical recipes back to life. We were both enjoying the byproducts of yeast. We were sipping on a beer while our kids are splashing in the pool, and we were brainstorming interesting places to find yeast to use in Danny's historical recipes when he shared that the John Marshall House right here in Richmond has 200-year-old bottles of Madeira wine in their collection. And I thought, well, what secrets are locked in those bottles of wine? And what can science teach us about those secrets? Could we get living yeast out of those bottles? Could you or I someday drink a beer made with the same yeast that made our founding fathers' favorite beverage? Could I take decades of technological breakthroughs and precise methodologies, not to mention my own expertise, and funnel them into studying wine? Why not? So John Marshall was a huge fan of Madeira wine, and he's not alone. If you look at early writings on American history, you'll see references to Washington, Jefferson, Adams drinking wine. And the reason for that is that beer and wine were common everyday beverages then. Some people trusted it more than water. Wine was so well loved that Benjamin Franklin once said, "Behold the rain which falls from the heavens into our vineyards, there to enter the roots and be changed into wine. A constant proof that God loves us and loves to see us happy." Now, I like to be happy. I like a nice glass of wine, but especially when it's combined with good company and a topic I'm passionate about. And John Marshall and I have that in common. John Marshall is a great compromiser, and he would often meet one-on-one with colleagues in order to effect big change. He started his political career right here in the House of Delegates and was part of the constitutional delegation at the time that Virginia was choosing whether or not to ratify the Constitution. And many Virginians were against ratification. As a large and wealthy state, we would be giving up power to a federal government. But 9 states had already ratified the Constitution, which meant that was enough for the new nation to be born. And could you imagine a new United States without Virginia? It would be fractured geographically and destabilized, and Marshall knew that. And so he used his power of persuasion one by taking his fellow delegates out to a pub here in Richmond, often over a glass of Madeira wine, and convinced them of the importance of ratification. Years later, he would become the 4th Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he would hold that position for 35 years, and that's where he really made his mark. He wanted to elevate the stature of the Supreme Court. And he chose to do so by trying to create more unity among the justices and their decisions. So he somehow convinced all the justices to live together in the same boarding house in DC, and they would share meals, and they would share a glass of wine, apparently only when it rained. I'm not sure why they had that rule. But Marshall was flexible. If one of his justices saw that the skies were clear, he would say, "So much the better. For our jurisdiction extends over such a large territory that the doctrine of chances makes it sure that it's got to be raining somewhere." Now, Marshall oversaw over 1,100 decisions on his Supreme Court, and almost all of them were unanimous. Some of those decisions set important precedences that still define our court today, and you have to wonder what the role of Madeira wine was in that. How did wine help lubricate the compromises and decisions that were so important to our country's founding? And so now I'm going to try to use modern molecular techniques to learn about this historic wine. And I think this story is an interesting example of how scientists work and how we get projects started. Well, first of all, scientists don't work alone. We build on the work of others, and we get inspiration in interesting places. In the course of setting up this project, I've talked to other molecular biologists, wine scientists, chemists, historians, and even an expert on Madeira. And one of the interesting early obstacles in this project was actually how to get the wine. These are the bottles shown here. And these bottles are corked and they're covered with wax, and the wax has a seal in it. And so this is a historical artifact. Preservation Virginia, who takes care of the John Marshall House, they're enthusiastic about us using science to understand their artifacts in a new way. But it is a historical artifact. I can't just pop open the cork. So how do I get wine out of a bottle I can't open? I wanted to try to use needles to go through the cork, but I would need something sturdy, several inches long, and something that wouldn't get clogged up with the cork as it went through. So I called a friend of mine who's a medical doctor and asked him to join me over, you guessed it, a glass of wine, and asked some questions about surgical procedures. I thought surely there must be some procedure where doctors have to go several inches into the body but have something inside the needle so it doesn't get filled with tissue until it's at the right place. He told me I'm describing a spinal tap. So I ordered some spinal tap needles and I'm ready to go. So I can take the wax, I can soften it slightly with some heat, and I can slip that needle between the cork and the glass, remove the insert, and have clear access to the wine. When I'm done, any minuscule hole that remains can be covered with the original wax. Now I have one shot to try this on a historical bottle of wine. So I've been perfecting the extraction and all the other experiments we're going to do later on modern bottles of wine. Now those wine bottles are for experimental purposes only. We do not drink them. That's like, you don't drink in the lab. That's safety 101. But ultimately, what I'm going to do is pull out a couple ounces of wine and the sediment in the bottles, and the first thing I'll do is look at them under a microscope to see if I can see any intact cells. Because yeast can go into a type of hibernation state where they can form spores that are very hardy. So there's a chance that there may be some yeast that are alive in that bottle. If we can rouse even one from hibernation, we can grow it in the lab and keep multiplying it until we have enough to work with. Now, getting living yeast out of a 200 bottle of booze is a long shot. And there are a couple reports of people saying they've done it, but it's not clear how many people have actually tried. Madeira wine in particular might be tough. It's a fortified wine like a port, and that high alcohol percentage is going to be hard on the yeast, but actually a really good preservative for the yeast DNA. So in addition to trying to get yeast cells out, I'll extract DNA from the wine and see what it can teach us. To understand what DNA will teach us about wine, you have to understand a little bit more about what DNA does. But don't worry, after a short conversation on DNA, we'll get back to wine. So DNA is like a massive cookbook that contains all the instructions needed for a creature to exist. This is true for you and me. It's true for yeast, grapes, hops, even creatures who have nothing to do with alcohol. And every cookbook contains a huge number of recipes, which scientists call genes. Every gene encodes the information for one resource that the cell needs, and most of those resources are proteins. Everything in your body is either a protein itself, it's made by a protein, or it's influenced by a protein. Proteins are doing most of the work in your cells, and in fact, a third of your energy every day is spent just making the proteins your body needs. Our DNA cookbook is not used directly by the cells. When they need a recipe, they will make a copy of that DNA called mRNA, and they'll make that on demand as needed. And then there are little machines in your cells that will read the RNA and use those instructions to make the resource that's needed. Our DNA cookbooks are diverse, just like your cookbooks at home allow you to create a multitude of dishes. We have genes that create proteins that allow us to smell the notes of clove in a wine. Proteins that help us remember the label of the Malbec we enjoyed on our honeymoon. And importantly, proteins that help you break down the alcohol so you can eventually drive safely home. So let's just take a second to appreciate all that our DNA has done for us. Now, understanding how our cells control DNA and RNA to control the resources that it needs is a fundamental question of biology. And most of the time, that's what my lab studies. And we use yeast to study it because they're a lot simpler than a human cell. But believe it or not, at the molecular level, when it comes to this stuff, they're pretty similar. So yeast can even teach us about what it means to be human. And as much as I love humans, I'm going to get back to yeast because they can do something we can't. They can turn grape juice into wine. And how do yeast do that? Well, all that information is encoded in its DNA. Modern molecular biology techniques allow us to take small amounts of DNA out of the wine bottle and amplify it so there's enough to work with. And then we can read the sequences of the genes in the yeast. Yeast have thousands of genes, and some of them are important for fermentation and creating the flavors that are important for wine. So by reading the sequences of these recipes, we can compare yeast from 200 years ago to yeast today and see how is winemaking the same and how is it different. Additionally, every species of yeast has its own special DNA sequences that make it unique. So just like a forensic scientist can use DNA technology to figure out who is at a crime scene or who your biological father is, I can use similar technology to figure out exactly what species of yeast is in that bottle. And that's not a trivial question. There are 1,500 species of yeast on the planet, and only some of them are good for making wine. While I'm trying to unlock the secrets in the DNA, my colleague, Christine Nolan, who is a chemist, will do a chemical analysis of the wine. And together, we'll be able to see how Madeira from 200 years ago, a drink loved by our founding fathers, compares to its modern-day counterpart. Humanity has been harnessing the fermentation power of yeast for over 7,000 years in making beer and wine. But only in the past couple of decades have we been able to use DNA technology to start unlocking those secrets of what makes a yeast help make a bright ale versus a complex Pinot Noir. And we can now use molecular biology to unseal the secrets in these old bottles of wine and look at historical artifacts collecting dust in a museum in an entirely different way. We might be able to find more about the favorite drink of our founding fathers. They even toasted the Declaration of Independence with Madeira. And we might learn something new about how we can use yeast today. I think, as John Marshall would agree, great things can come from a glass of wine. Thank you.